this video, we are looking at the ethical and intercultural understanding capabilities, and we're going to do some activities on that. But first, we kind of need to understand what it's all about, and very specifically, why it's important to us at this stage in our learning. So the first thing that SACE outlined for ethical understanding is the purpose of developing an ethical understanding is to foster the development of personal values and attributes such as honesty, resilience, empathy, and respect for others. It's also the capacity to act with ethical integrity. And this is hopefully obvious as to why that's important. And this is where they've broken the ethical understanding down into. So understanding ethical concepts and issues, reasoning in decision-making and actions, exploring values, rights, and responsibilities. So the SACE learning outcomes for this is talking about learning and understanding this capability, what it's about, why it's important, understanding how ethical issues and dilemmas arise in personal and public situations, reflecting on actions and their consequences in areas such as learning and workplace decision-making. So this is very important, actions and consequences, both in school, but also more importantly, when you go out into the workforce, the way that you behave, how ethically and respectfully you behave, will have very significant consequences based on that. Exploring personal values and various points of view to understand individual and group rights and responsibilities. So just being able to basically take in someone else's point of view and not just be all about, well, that's not what I agree with, so I'm gonna crush that. Considering workplace safety and ethical principles, practices, and procedures, and this is one of the things I'm going to look at today. I'm going to talk to you about what are your actual rights and what are the laws around how you're treated and what you're entitled to in the workplace, as well as developing ethical, sustainable practices in the workplace and community. Okay, so explaining ways to consider ethical decisions through the burger dilemma. So this is talking about if you were a business owner, how would you deal with this sort of situation? So this is a little TED video that talks about a couple of different ways that you consider what is ethical, and there's a few approaches to that. And I want you to, take in the three main ways that they talk about how you decide whether something is ethical, but also consider what would you do in this situation, or what do you believe is the right thing to do.
A few years ago, you founded a company that manufactures meatless burgers. Your product is now sold in stores worldwide, but you've recently received awful news. 3 unrelated people in one city died after eating your burgers. The police concluded that a criminal targeted your brand, injecting poison into your product in at least 2 grocery stores. The culprit used an ultra-fine instrument that left no trace on the packaging, making it impossible to determine which products were compromised. Your burgers were immediately removed from the 2 stores where the victims bought them. The deaths are headline news. The killer is still at large, and sales have plummeted. You must quickly develop a strategy to deal with the crisis. Your team comes up with 3 options. 1. Do nothing. 2. Pull the products from grocery stores citywide and destroy them. Or 3. Pull and destroy the product worldwide. Which do you choose? Your company lawyer explains that a recall is not required by law because the criminal is fully responsible. She recommends the first option, doing nothing, because recalling the product could look like an admission of fault. But is that the most ethical strategy? To gauge the ethicality of each choice, you could perform a stakeholder analysis. This would allow you to weigh the interests of some key stakeholders, investors, employees, and customers against one another. With the first option, your advisors project that the crisis will eventually blow over. Sales will then improve but probably stay below prior levels because of damage to the brand. As a result, you'll have to lay off some employees, and investors will suffer minor losses. But more customers could die if the killer poisoned packages elsewhere. The second option is expensive in the short term and will require greater employee layoffs and additional financial loss to investors. But this option is safer for customers in the city and could create enough trust that sales will eventually rebound. The third option is the most expensive in the short term and will require significant employee layoffs and investor losses. Though you have no evidence that these crimes are an international threat, this option provides the greatest customer protection. Given the conflict between the interests of your customers versus those of your investors and employees, which strategy is the most ethical? To make this decision, you could consider these tests. First is the utilitarian test. Utilitarianism is a philosophy concerned with maximizing the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. What would be the impact of each option on these terms? Second is the family test. How would you feel explaining your decision to your family? Third is the newspaper test. How would you feel reading about it on the front page of the local newspaper? And finally, you could use the mentor test. If someone you admire were making this decision, what would they do? Johnson & Johnson's CEO, James Burke, faced a similar challenge in 1982 after a criminal added the poison cyanide to bottles of Tylenol in Chicago. 7 people died and sales dropped. Industry analysts said the company was done for. In response, Burke decided to pull Tylenol from all shelves worldwide, citing customer safety as the company's highest priority. Johnson & Johnson recalled and destroyed an estimated 32 million bottles of Tylenol, valued at $250 million in today's dollars. 1.5 million of the recalled bottles were tested, and 3 of them, all from the Chicago area, were found to contain cyanide. Burke's decision helped the company regain the trust of its customers, and product sales rebounded within a year. Prompted by the Tylenol murders, Johnson & Johnson became a leader in developing tamper-resistant packaging, and the government instituted stricter regulations. The killer, meanwhile, was never caught. Burke's decision prevented further deaths from the initial poisoning, but the federal government investigated hundreds of copycat tampering incidents involving other products in the following weeks. Could these have been prevented with a different response? Was Burke acting in the interest of the public or of his company? Was this good ethics or good marketing? As with all ethical dilemmas, this has no clear right or wrong answer. And for your meatless burger empire, the choice remains yours. Would you sacrifice one person to save 5? Unpack this famous ethical dilemma with our video on the trolley problem. Or learn how the efforts of one scientist at the FDA prevented a national health crisis.
So if you haven't already heard of the trolley problem, you could go have a look at that as well. But that's basically that concept of you're on a trolley, which is an old-fashioned word for a train that's lost control, and you've got the option of either doing nothing and the train is going to plow through 5 people, or you can pull the lever on the switch to change tracks, and a result of that is that you'll kill one person. And so it's that dilemma of, is it better to kill one person by your own action, by changing the lever, or is it okay to say, well, I just stood by and did nothing and 5 people died? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. Interestingly, with this video, there is a very real-world application to this that's quite recent. And if you remember the incident with the strawberries and the needles, someone was going and putting pins or needles inside strawberries. And this is basically the exact same issue that the companies had to consider. Do we pull pull the product, the strawberries, from just that town or that state, or do we go globally and pull all of our strawberries from everywhere in the country or the world? And as we saw in Australia when this happened, there were copycats. So this started to happen in multiple states and multiple towns because of that copycat effect, because unfortunately people out there thought that this was, I don't know, funny or whatever, or they're just sick, and they mimicked that problem. So had the company just said, oh, well, this has only happened in this little town, we'll pull the strawberries, people still got injured and very unhealthy or whatever in other areas because of that copycat. So it really raises some interesting questions as to how you should actually react. And this is where that ethical understanding comes from. So some of the everyday future ethics that you need to be aware of are things like the workplace ethics and your rights. So that's as an employee. And this includes things like the Enterprise Bargaining Agreement, which is the EB for short, your break entitlements, and pretty much all of your rights and obligations as part of an employee for a company. And that's anything. That's whether you work for the government, whether you work for a private contractor. The examples I'm going to show you shortly are about being a builder if you're in the construction industry. Fair Work SA is a government organisation that have all of these laws about your rights and your responsibilities. So the ethics doesn't just have to be how should you act and how should you behave, but it's also how should your employer act, and how should you be treated ethically. Other things to consider are like your leave entitlements and the privacy laws. Often people say, oh, you're not allowed to look at that, you're not allowed to do that because I have my own privacy laws. And it's actually interesting when you look into what those privacy laws are, about what's considered a public place and what's considered a private place. And that's ultimately the key behind when you're covered by privacy laws and when you're not. And you may actually be surprised on situations when there is no privacy laws against your secrecy and people can share that information, people can record you, things like that. The other one that we'll mention is the ethics of tax claims. And so especially as you start getting your jobs, and more so once you finish school and go into the industry and you exceed that tax threshold, you have to submit a tax claim every year. And there are things in there that you can claim and seemingly you can get away with without requiring any evidence. You can just claim it. But is that ethical? And that's the question. Is it okay to just claim something or request money for something purely because you can get away with it? Is that ethical? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Another example for ethical situations is the McDonald's lawsuit case. There's a link on the video and in this slide that takes you to a really good podcast series called Swindled, and that's an episode about the McDonald's lawsuit. And this is a very famous one where basically a lady sued McDonald's for burning herself with a cup of coffee, and the media ran with it and created this hype about how ridiculous it is in America for suing people for anything like that. But when you actually look into the details, ultimately what happened was that McDonald's as a company were aware that the temperature of their coffee was much, much hotter than it needed to be. And they're aware that the temperature they served coffee was actually deemed very dangerous. You could instantly burn yourself by exposing yourself to this coffee. However, they sell about 1 million to 1 billion cups of coffee every single day. And they figured that if they dropped the temperature of their coffee, they may lose quite a large number of customers. So financially for them, they made the conscious decision to keep it at that dangerous temperature and sell it rather than risk losing customers. And they figured that by selling 1 million to 1 billion cups of coffee every day, they would just pay off any of the lawsuits that arose, and that would be cheaper than potentially losing customers by dropping the temperature of their coffee. So again, that's a really interesting lawsuit case. And technically there is no law against that. It's not illegal. There was no law about the temperature coffee had to be served. But if you think about it ethically, it seems a bit dodgy that they've consciously chosen profits over people's well-being, knowing that that was a significant risk. And ultimately, that's what that lawsuit was about. So if you go to the Fair Work SA page, and again, I've linked this on the OneNote, it's a simple process. It's a very step-by-step. It asks you all these questions. And I followed this process to find the award for a builder. So say you wanted to be just a general construction builder, either industrial or non-commercial. It gives you that option as you work your way down. But basically it looks a bit like this. So you start by saying, I want an award. It asks, are you covered? You say yes. What's your role in industry? I've already clicked builder. In this case, I've said I'm an apprentice builder because this is more applicable to anyone in the class that's thinking about this pathway. It says what industry, building and construction is the path I'm going to go for. And you follow it down and it says see the award information. So this is some of the things that I found. For example, the award tells you your hourly rate, including allowances. So this is the minimum rate. So if you become an apprentice builder and they're paying you less than $13.81, you maybe need to have that conversation with them or speak to the Fair Work SA Ombudsman about this, because this could actually be an illegal practice. Unless you've signed a specific contract, you are entitled to a minimum of this amount. Same with weekly, which will probably just be adjusted, including salaries and things like that. And they tell you what the award is that you're actually entitled to. There's also more information that you can go into, such as things like this. So this is the information for notice of termination, and this is about basically if you are fired or laid off or anything like that, it tells you how much notice they have to give you. So the period of continuous service within the employment ends, blah, blah, blah. If you haven't worked for more than a year, you have to be given a minimum of 1 week's notice. So if your boss says to you, hey, we've got no more work for you, don't come in tomorrow, this is actually in breach of the Fair Work FSA award. They have to give you 1 week's notice, which means they have to continue to pay you for that 1 week, and then your termination starts from that point. This is, of course, assuming that you're a full-time employee. If you're casual, that's very different. They could basically just get rid of you on the spot with no notice whatsoever. But for part-time and full-time, you fit under these awards. And again, it changes. If you've been there for more than a year but not more than 3 years, then that pushes out to 2 weeks notice. So these are really important things for you to know as you go into the industry, and especially if you're thinking about this industry, have a look at the award and figure out what are my entitlements. Get an idea of what is this job like. Will it actually be a kind job to me, or am I kind of getting abused and put through the system? Another thing to consider, which is also very important, is getting paid. And in this case, under that award, it said that must be paid and available no later than the end of ordinary hours on work on Thursday of each week. So in this case, they're basically saying you can't be paid later than weekly on a Thursday, unless you've signed a contract that says otherwise. So if you're signing a custom contract, make sure you read that and you agree with these kind of things. But ultimately, you get an idea of the average person is getting paid weekly, no later than Thursday. So you get an idea, okay, I'm going to get paid weekly. Great. A few other things, such as breaks. So in this case, it says that you must have a cessation of work or a meal break of no less than 30 minutes between noon and 1 p.m. So that's working full-time again in this case for a day worker, but you must be given a break no less than 30 minutes between 12 o'clock and 1 p.m. That is the award. So if you miss that lunch period or they don't give you that lunch period, you are entitled to claim it. You can say, hey, no, I'm going on my break. It's 12:30 or it's 1 o'clock. I need to take this break now. And legally, you are covered by that. They can't deny you that right. Another thing is if you're a shift worker, for example, no later than 5 hours after the shift, there must be a break of 30 minutes. So you cannot work more than 5 hours without a break. That's another really important one. You can't just work 7 hours straight because it's super busy. That's actually in breach of the award, and that's more of a safety thing. So these are really important things to know as you go out there. Now we're going to do the first little activity. So I want you to know about your ethical rights. So pick the profession that you're currently interested in and use the one that you've addressed in that folio task. Go to the Fair Work SA page and find your award and find out things like the minimum wage, the termination notice, your break entitlements, leave entitlements, and any other workplace condition requirements that you think are relevant or applicable to you. Make a note of these because these will be really useful in a later folio assignment that we do. You can include them in the current one. There's probably a section later on in section 3 where you can link this and link this to the ethical understanding. It's a great way to demonstrate this capability, which is what PLP and what the assignments are all about. But later on in particular, it will be very, very useful. So make a note of this somewhere that you have access to later. So pause the video here, go do that, and then come back to it. The next thing for, again, a very modern or futuristic aspect to ethical understanding is the ethics in self-driving cars. So in the video that you're about to see, I want you to consider the following questions. Would you purchase a self-driving car that does the least harm, or would you rather something that protects the driver, or you, the most? And which of these do you think is ethically better? That it protects you at all costs, or it does the least amount of harm in general in any situation? The next thing to consider is, does this decision then imply that you have premeditated the outcome of a crash? And are you then responsible for the outcome, or is it on your conscience? So if you buy the car that protects you, and then it runs down a small child to prevent you from running off a bridge, for example, are you now liable or are you now guilty of running down that child because you've made the decision to purchase that car? So does that then weigh on your conscience? And lastly, what do you think is the best option for programming a self-driving car? How might you justify it? Do you go with what they talk about of the least harm? protect you the most, or can you think of another way that you might balance this? And again, make a note of this because this will be useful later on and when we demonstrate ethical understanding in a later assignment.
This is a thought experiment. Let's say at some point in the not-so-distant future, you're barreling down the highway in your self-driving car, and you find yourself boxed in on all sides by other cars. Suddenly, a large, heavy object falls off the truck in front of you. Your car can't stop in time to avoid the collision, so it needs to make a decision. Go straight and hit the object, swerve left into an SUV, or swerve right into a motorcycle. Should it prioritize your safety by hitting the motorcycle, minimize danger to others by not swerving, even if it means hitting the large object and sacrificing your life, or take the middle ground by hitting the SUV, which has a high passenger safety rating? So what should the self-driving car do? If we were driving that boxed-in car in manual mode, whichever way we'd react would be understood as just that, a reaction, not a deliberate decision. It would be an instinctual, panicked move with no forethought or malice. But if a programmer were to instruct the car to make the same move, given conditions it may sense in the future, well, that looks more like premeditated homicide. Now, to be fair, self-driving cars are predicted to dramatically reduce traffic accidents and fatalities by removing human error from the driving equation. Plus, there may be all sorts of other benefits: eased road congestion, decreased harmful emissions, and minimized unproductive and stressful driving time. But accidents can and will still happen, and when they do, their outcomes may be determined months or years in advance by programmers or policymakers. And they'll have some difficult decisions to make. It's tempting to offer up general decision-making principles like minimize harm, but even that quickly leads to morally murky decisions. For example, let's say we have the same initial setup, but now there's a motorcyclist wearing a helmet to your left and another one without a helmet to your right. Which one should your robot car crash into? If you say the biker with the helmet because she's more likely to survive, then aren't you penalizing the responsible motorist? If instead you say the biker without the helmet because he's acting irresponsibly, then you've gone way beyond the initial design principle about minimizing harm, and the robot car is now meting out street justice. The ethical considerations get more complicated here. In both of our scenarios, the underlying design is functioning as a targeting algorithm of sorts. In other words, it's systematically favoring or discriminating against a certain type of object to crash into. And the owners of the target vehicles will suffer the negative consequences of this algorithm through no fault of their own. Our new technologies are opening up many other novel ethical dilemmas. For instance, if you had to choose between a car that would always save as many lives as possible in an accident, or one that would save you at any cost, which would you buy? What happens if the cars start analyzing and factoring in the passengers of the cars and the particulars of their lives? Could it be the case that a random decision is still better than a predetermined one designed to minimize harm? And who should be making all of these decisions anyhow? Programmers? Companies? Governments? Reality may not play out exactly like our thought experiments, but that's not the point. They're designed to isolate and stress test our intuitions on ethics, just like science experiments do for the physical world. Spotting these moral hairpin turns now will help us maneuver the unfamiliar road of technology ethics and allow us to cruise confidently and conscientiously into our brave new future.
So that's a really interesting concept of, again, a very futuristic and yet modern day problem with the self-driving cars and the AI technology as well. And you see this all the time at a very basic level. The cars that have those things like the lane changing assistance, the self-parking features, all of these things, these play the same part. If you have a car that parks itself and then something goes wrong and it slams into another car, is it your fault or is it the manufacturer's fault? And in this case, there's a lot of statements that they make and disclaimers saying, keep your hand on the wheel at all times. You should be in control of it so that they're not liable. But then when it comes into something like a self-driving car, a lot of these don't even have a steering wheel. So you can't control it. It's completely run by the programming of the machine. And this is a very grey area. The law hasn't quite caught up with it. There are no black and white laws on who is liable. It comes down to this ethical debate of who can we blame in this situation. So the next thing to talk about in terms of ethics is the tax return. And I mentioned this earlier. So in 2019 to 2020, 641 cases of successful tax prosecutions were recorded for fraudulent claims. This resulted in $4 million in fines throughout Australia. One seemingly harmless but equally fraudulent case is the following. When you submit a tax return, you can claim up to $30 for a washing expense of a uniform without requiring a receipt. As soon as you go beyond $30, you have to then have either receipts or some sort of a logbook or evidence to demonstrate that expense. But you can claim $30 basically for free for washing your uniform. And this is basically to cover things like washing powder and stuff like that. And realistically, that doesn't seem like much. It wouldn't be hard to justify that. You can buy a packet of washing powder for about $30, and that's certainly not going to last an entire year of washing a uniform. But the question is, if your uniform is washed by your parents, your employer washes it for you in some cases, particularly in things like industry and mechanical worlds. Often you might have a uniform or like overalls that the employer washes and then brings back to you. If you incur no expense for this thing, is it then ethical to still claim that $30? So simply because you don't have to prove it to the government, is it ethical to just claim this free $30 and say that you are washing your uniform? Given that there's a very, very high chance that they're never actually going to investigate it unless there's something else dodgy on your tax return, does that then make it okay? Something to consider is, let's say we say yes. Let's say, well, the government take a lot of tax from us, they don't do anything for us, whatever. $30, it's nothing. Consider the fact that there's 35.36 million people in Australia at the moment. If every one of those people go with that mindset and say, oh, it's just $30, I'll claim it, and it's the least that the government can do for me, that works out to $1 billion just on this $30 laundry fee alone. And there are many other cases in a tax return where similar things apply, such as deducting travel expense. You can claim a certain amount of cents per litre, cents per kilometre for driving for work purposes. And again, this allows you to claim up to a certain amount without needing a logbook. So there's multiple examples where this could happen. And if the general population or the majority of the population go with this mindset that it's okay to, in a nutshell, rip off the government, we can work out to billions and millions of dollars that the government is forking out to people for these fraudulent claims. And so it's a very small scale. You think $30 is nothing, but it's something that you need to consider every time that you do a tax return. You've got to think to yourself, is this ethical? And think about the video we watched before. Use those tests. Would I be comfortable talking to my family and telling my family about this? Would I be comfortable if this was published in a newspaper or on social media that I'd done this? And what effect can it have on other people? So the next activity is to develop a list of your own personal values and prioritize the top 10. So we're talking about your values, your personal beliefs, things like that. Prioritize the top 10 values. Once you've done that, I want you to have a chat with the people around you, just briefly, and compare and discuss what your values are. Remember, there is no right or wrong. So just because you might put something like, kindness or ethical or ethics really high up, and the person you talk to didn't, that's completely fine. Everyone has their own different priorities. As long as being a serial killer is not your high priority, that's one of the exceptions where, yes, it's maybe not a good thing to have as your personal value. But in general, it's all about you and what you prioritize. And this is a great reflection, which ironically is the next assignment that we do. It's all about a personal reflection linked to these capabilities. So again, very useful. Make a note of these values and your beliefs. Record them somewhere in a OneNote section or a Word document in a PLP folder, and we'll use this later on. The last piece for this lesson is the intercultural understanding. So explain this as exploring this capability, being relevant to your personal and learning goals, learning about and developing respect for people's social and cultural backgrounds, enabling people to live and work together, developing empathy and understanding by interacting and creating connections, exploring global citizenship, including the impact on their roles and responsibilities in the future and work environments, developing skills to relate to, move between cultures, and acknowledging the social, cultural, linguistic, religious diversity of a nation, including our own Aboriginal and Torres Strait societies within Australia. So they're talking about recognising culture and developing respect, a really big one. Recognising culture and respect is very, very important at all stages in life. Reflecting on intercultural experiences and taking responsibility, and interacting and empathising with others. So even though at first glance it might seem like a little bit ambiguous, what does this even mean? It's ultimately all about empathising with others, interacting with others of different cultures, being respectful and things like that.
Intercultural awareness may sound more complicated than it actually is. Let's follow Tim and have a look at what it means. If you went backpacking around the world, you would find that people behave in very different ways. Let's take a simple thing like greeting somebody. In different cultures, it can look like this, or even this. Now, the beautiful thing about our international Testo community is you get to meet people from all over the world. It also means that you have to team up with them for global success in order to avoid misunderstandings and to work together effectively. That can be tricky because different cultures have different perspectives on things. When it comes to time, for example, or to personal space. Sometimes intercultural communication can be confusing. And even simple things like dining habits may need getting used to. So how do we gain intercultural awareness? By exchanging our different points of view and working on it together as one big community. And these 10 bullet points will help us in intercultural situations. Be open to new encounters and curious for new experiences. Don't be afraid. Be vigilant and observe so you won't make a faux pas. And, of course, respect foreign customs, rituals and culture. Be patient, and in case somebody does not behave how you expect, don't take it personally. Be kind-hearted. Share your own customs and culture with others. And finally, share your intercultural experience with colleagues and friends. That's the way to cultivate intercultural awareness at Testo.
Intercultural understanding, particularly, I mean, it's always been important, but particularly in the way that society and technology is going, it's so easy to link to every part of the world instantaneously. And multiple companies, universities, research institutes, etc., are all working worldwide, and they're collaborating and they're communicating, things like that. So you may end up working for an international organization and you have to communicate with other branches across the world. You may report back to a manager or a boss on the other side of the world. These kind of things happen all the time now. So it's really important that we have that awareness of other cultures and that we're open to trying the new things. We're open to the respect of their culture. So like the simple example they showed in that video is taking your shoes off, which is commonly linked with a very Japanese tradition that they take their shoes off when they go into the house, things like that. Just following those simple things and just being open to embracing that culture goes a long way in understanding and embracing and building these relationships. So for this last activity, we're looking at sport bringing people together. So I want you to pick a random sport, and how I want you to do that is just think of a random number between 1 and 26, link that number to the alphabet. So the letter A is number 1, B is 2, so on and so forth. Once you've got that number linked to the letter, I want you to think of a sport that starts with that letter. Then research the sport and make a list of all the countries that play that sport. If it's something like, say, soccer, for example, obviously there's going to be a lot of countries. It's one of the biggest sports in the world. Just come up with a list, but not every single country. Then research that sport a little bit more and find out about 4 of the countries that you listed specifically. And for those countries, I want you to find their current population. What is the primary religion of that country? What is their national food dish? Or just some common food choices? What is the type of government they have? As in democratic? Is it dictatorship? Is it communist? All those kind of things. What kind of government do they run? And what are some of the things that are highly respected, or some of the things that they may consider as a sign of disrespect for that culture? So that'll give you that awareness of, say you pick a European country, they might highly respect loyalty. Or, for example, a lot of Chinese and Japanese cultures are very, very big on that loyalty and that respect towards the family. It's all about honour. A sign of disrespect might be, like I mentioned earlier, wearing shoes in a house, or lying to a family member, or anything like that. So find something that is linked to that culture that is highly respected, and something that could be considered a sign of disrespect. And that concludes the video for today on ethical and cultural understanding. Once you've completed all those activities, you can use the remaining time to continue working on your folio task. Girl, you can be my